In March 2023, a farmer in rural Argentina found his brother standing barefoot in a burnt circle of grass, clutching a bronze pendant that experts say predates human civilization by 20,000 years. In early 2023, researchers from the University of Buenos Aires and independent UFO investigators documented over 40 disappearances across Patagonia, all linked to sightings of glowing triangular craft. The missing people were later found disoriented, often holding strange artifacts made from alloys unknown to modern science. Some artifacts carried inscriptions matching symbols recorded in declassified CIA documents from Project Blue Book. Satellite data from ESA showed sudden heat signatures in isolated regions within seconds of each abduction event. If these reports are true, it suggests that an advanced intelligence is deliberately collecting not just humans, but specific objects that could rewrite our understanding of history. Families are terrified. Many believe their ancestors were targeted before, and that these events are part of a centuries-long harvest of genetic traits and ancient relics. Governments are under pressure to disclose what they know, as leaked documents hint at secret agreements to allow these retrieval missions, in exchange for technology transfers. Today, I'm going to share true conspiracy stories from real people who say aliens are collecting rare humans and ancient artifact stories that might keep you up at night. Before we dive in, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Thanks for joining. They are watching. We were never alone. Those were the last words my grandfather ever wrote, scrawled in a trembling hand across the final page of his journal. I didn't believe them till the day the crate arrived. I remember the sound it made when I pried the lid open in my quiet attic. The scent of aged cedar and something metallic slipped into the dusty air. At first, I thought it was just another box of brittle letters or yellowed newspaper clippings, more relics of my family's reputation for chasing absurd legends. But when I pulled back the folded canvas, I saw the journal, bound in cracked leather, corners charred as though someone had tried to burn it out of existence. My pulse slowed, a peculiar calm settling over me. Even after everything, after decades of ridicule from colleagues who called my grandfather a fraud, part of me hoped there was still something here that mattered. I set the crate aside and carried the journal to my work table, afraid it might crumble if I moved too quickly. Each page was dense with sketches, field notes, and coordinate strings he'd transcribed by hand. His entries described a place I'd never seen on any map somewhere in the Nevada desert, past the grid lines of any official survey. He called it the chamber, as though there were only one. The first time I read his words, subterranean vault, composition unknown, symbols not of terrestrial origin, I felt a shiver run the length of my spine. By the time the sun slipped behind the ridge, I'd read every word. I wanted to believe he'd been delusional, that the telegram he sent days before he vanished was the final act of a man unraveling. But the details were too precise. The sketches too meticulous. He hadn't imagined this. He'd seen it. I locked the journal away and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that chamber. I saw the strange symbols etched in neat rows across a polished wall. By dawn, I'd decided I couldn't just dismiss this as family folklore. If I was ever going to clear his name more, I only had to see for myself whether any of it was real. 2 days later, I drove out to the old research cabin he'd used as a staging site. It stood alone at the edge of a dry wash, a lopsided wooden box that had survived more storms and intrusions than I could count. My grandmother had stopped coming here after he disappeared. She said it felt like standing inside a wound that refused to close. The air inside was stale, thick with the memory of oil lamps and old coffee. I set my pack on the counter and began searching for anything he might have hidden. The first hours yielded nothing, just brittle maps, sample vials, receipts for excavation equipment. But in the last cabinet, tucked behind a loose panel, I found a safe. The combination was scratched into the wood beneath it in my grandfather's handwriting. I held my breath as I turned the dial. The safe creaked open to reveal a single object wrapped in oilcloth. When I unwrapped it, my hands started to shake. It was a fragment of something metallic, lightweight, cool to the touch, inscribed with the same unfamiliar symbols he'd drawn in the journal. But the compartment where he must have stored the rest of his evidence was empty. Someone had been here before me. That night, I sat on the narrow porch beneath a sky too clear for comfort, the journal in my lap. Every instinct told me to walk away, to leave these questions buried with the rest of his unfinished life. But I couldn't. I'd spent years building a career in artifacts everyone agreed were real. Now, for the first time, I was holding something. That made me question everything I'd ever studied. When I finally closed the journal, I felt the first hint of dread. Not because of the fragment itself, but because of the pattern that kept repeating in my mind, something my grandfather had written over and over in the margins. They erased the evidence. They erased the people who find it. I knew then that if I kept going, I wouldn't be able to stop. And even if the truth was waiting out there in the desert, I might never come back. But as dawn broke across the wash, I made my decision. I was going to retrace his steps, because I needed to know what he'd seen, and because, despite everything, part of me was starting to believe he'd been right all along. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Part of me knew that if I did, the story would end before it began. I drove west under a flat sky, the crate and the journal strapped into the passenger seat like companions I couldn't afford to lose. As the miles slipped past, I rehearsed the reasons this was a mistake. My career, my safety, my sanity. But the fragment in my pack felt heavier than it should. A reminder that some truths don't care about consequences. By dusk, I reached a motel just outside Tonopah. The sign flickered above a gravel lot littered with wind-blown plastic. I paid cash for the room and carried the journal inside, feeling like someone watching themselves in a dream. The walls were thin enough to hear the couple next door arguing over something small and ordinary. I envied them. At the desk, I spread out the last few pages of my grandfather's notes. He'd written a string of numbers that looked random at first glance, rows of coordinates interrupted by letters, but I knew his habits. He always used an archaic field code he'd developed in the early 60s, a cipher that layered text across spatial references. I'd grown up listening to him explain it at the kitchen table, his voice low and conspiratorial. Now, decades later, I used those lessons to reconstruct what he'd hidden. It took hours, the symbols blurred, the numbers tangled in my exhausted mind. But sometime after midnight, the pattern emerged, a grid of coordinates pointing to a stretch of desert deep inside a military exclusion zone. I cross-checked the location with public satellite imagery. What I found made my chest tighten. The area had been excavated recently. Fresh scoring in the sand, a geometric impression like the negative of a buried structure. Someone had dug their and covered their tracks. I slept in my clothes, the journal under my pillow. Every sound from the parking lot woke me. When morning came, I drove into town and parked across from the old Historical Society building. The sign on the door had faded to near illegibility. Inside, the air smelled of newsprint and stale coffee. I asked for any records from 1962 to 1965, anything connected to private expeditions or survey teams, operating outside federal permits. The woman behind the desk looked at me the way people always did when I mentioned those years, like I was trying to exhume something better left buried. I spent most of the day poring over microfilm, eyes burning from the strain. Eventually, I found a name I recognized. Walter Keane, my grandfather's field assistant. He was still alive, still living in a trailer on the outskirts of town. He answered the door slowly, as though expecting a debt collector. When he saw the journal in my hands, his expression changed. He didn't ask who I was. He just stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. Walter was frail, voice softened by age and regret. But when he spoke about the chamber, something flickered. Behind his eyes a memory too vivid to fade. He told me they'd found a metallic object buried under the vault floor, impossibly light and cold to the touch. He remembered my grandfather calling it an anchor, a term he never explained. His hands trembled as he described the day the military arrived. Men without insignia, trucks that left no tire marks. They seized everything: photos, samples, even the excavation tools. One of them held a folder stamped with a symbol I'd seen before, a pattern from the fragment in my pack. I asked Walter why he'd never spoken up. He just stared at the floor. Because they told us, he whispered, that what we'd found didn't belong to us. And if we insisted it did, none of us would ever see daylight again. As I drove back to the motel, I tried to convince myself he was exaggerating. But the fear in his voice was real. That night, I laid out the rubbings of the symbols we'd recovered from the safe. I tried to see them as curiosities, relics of a lost civilization, but part of me already knew better. The symbols weren't remnants of the past. They were instructions, coordinates, diagrams, something my grandfather had tried to decode. Didn't hear the intruder until the floorboard creaked behind me. By the time I turned, the door was already closing. The journal and the rubbings were gone. I stood in that cheap room, listening to my own heartbeat, and understood two things with perfect clarity. First, the conspiracy wasn't history. It was happening now. And second, I was going to follow this trail to the end, no matter who was trying to erase it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door I hadn't locked, replaying every moment I'd wasted thinking I still had time. By dawn, I'd packed what little I had left and driven east, away from Tonopah, away from the sense that any place I stopped would become a target. I thought about the man who had stood behind me, silent and deliberate, taking only what mattered. He hadn't rifled through my bag. He hadn't touched the fragment. He'd known exactly what he'd come for, and I was starting to suspect he was part of something that had been operating longer than I'd been alive. On the highway, I called. Every contact I still trusted, trying to trace the next lead before whoever was following me could erase it too. Most didn't answer. A few hung up before I finished explaining. But one name surfaced again and again: Colonel Parsons. He'd retired from the Air Force decades earlier. Quietly, no commendations, no interviews. But my grandfather had mentioned him in a letter. A single line I hadn't understood until now. Parsons knew the contract would last beyond the war. I found him in a weathered house near Lake Mead. The curtains were drawn. When I knocked, the door didn't open right away. I waited, hands at my sides, trying to look like anything but a threat. The man who finally appeared was older than I'd pictured, hollowed out by illness and something heavier. He studied me for a long moment before he spoke. "You look like your grandfather," he said, voice brittle as the wind. "I always wondered if someone in your family would come knocking." He didn't invite me inside. We sat on the porch, the heat pressing down like a hand. I showed him the fragment. His gaze shifted, but he didn't touch it. "It's all still there," he said finally. "Buried under 100 names and budgets no one will ever audit." They called it Project Hearth, but that was just the American face of it. The others had different names, different flags, same objective. I asked him what that objective was. For a while, he just stared at the horizon. "To curate," he said, "to contain what wasn't meant for us." He told me about the nights he'd spent overseeing transfers, crates that were too cold to handle without special gloves. A translucent sarcophagus moved under armed guard to an underground vault no official map acknowledged. He described my grandfather's last days, how he'd been detained, interrogated, convinced to sign a document promising he'd seen nothing at all. When I showed him the surveillance, photographs, grainy images of my grandfather restrained, being led toward an unmarked plane, Parsons didn't look away. "We all thought we had control," he said quietly. "We thought the visitors had left something inert. But you can't lock away something that's still awake." His breathing grew labored. I wanted to ask him more about the visitors, about what my grandfather had found in that chamber, but he raised a trembling hand. "If you've come this far," he said, "they already know you're looking." He pressed a folded sheet of paper into my palm. Coordinates scrawled in a hand unsteady with pain. "You want the proof," he whispered. "You'll find it there. But understand this, whatever you think you're uncovering, it doesn't end with you. You're just another link in the chain." When I left, I looked back once. Parsons sat hunched in his chair, staring past me into the empty road. It struck me that he'd been waiting for someone to finish this story long after he'd lost the strength to tell it himself. Back in the car, I unfolded the paper. The coordinates pointed North Colorado, a place my grandfather had circled. On an old survey map I'd thought was a dead end. As I pulled onto the highway, I checked the mirror. A black SUV was idling across the street. I didn't wait to see if it followed. I already knew it would. I drove on, the fragment in the passenger seat glinting like a promise. I'd spent years dismissing these stories as half-mad folklore, but every mile made one thing certain. The folklore was real. The watchers were real. And whatever they were hiding in that archive was worth more than any life they'd already destroyed. I kept driving until the gas gauge dropped below a quarter tank and my hands started to shake. I pulled into a rest stop, shut off the engine, and let the silence settle around me. In that moment, I realized I hadn't thought about what came after. What I'd do if I actually found what my grandfather died protecting. But I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I'd already passed the point where any version of my life could return to what it was. In the morning, I checked into a small motel west of Boulder under a name I hadn't used in years. I paid in cash, no questions asked. I waited until dusk before I took out the fragment again, studying the symbols etched into its surface. They reminded me of a language I almost understood, like a word hovering just past the edge of memory. The coordinates Parsons gave me pointed to an industrial lot near Loveland, a place that looked abandoned from the road. The only clue it was Still active was a faint hum when I stepped close to the locked gate, a vibration that seemed to run straight into my bones. I parked 2 blocks away and walked the perimeter. A single camera panned the lot in slow arcs, its lens glinting under the security lights. I waited for it to sweep away before I climbed the fence. Inside, the warehouse was cavernous, empty except for rows of wooden crates stacked floor to ceiling. The air was dry, heavy with the scent of treated wood and something sharper, ozone or old electronics. I moved carefully, checking labels on each crate until I found a small office tucked behind a half-collapsed partition. The desk held a metal ledger bound in cracked vinyl. I flipped it open, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. The manifest listed shipments going back decades. The headings were familiar: Project Hearth, Contingency Archive, Recovery Division. Each line cross-referenced coordinates I recognized from my grandfather's journal. One entry stopped me cold. Artifact Class D, destination, private aerospace contractor. Date, July 1973, the same month he disappeared. I traced the line with my fingertip, feeling the same dread that had haunted him. He'd spent his last days trying to keep something out of the hands of people who didn't just want to bury it, they wanted to use it, in the back of the office. I found a hidden compartment behind a rusted filing cabinet. Inside was a metal shard no bigger than my palm, etched with the same angular patterns as the fragment from the cabin safe. I wrapped it in a cloth and slipped it into my pack. When I stepped back into the main floor, the warehouse felt different, emptier somehow, as if whatever presence lingered here knew I'd uncovered something I wasn't supposed to. I reminded myself that fear was only useful if it kept me alert. So I took one last look at the ledger and started toward the exit. I'd almost reached the door when my phone buzzed. A single message, no sender. You are trespassing. I didn't waste time reading it again. I ran. Outside, the air was colder than before. I vaulted the fence and sprinted across the dark lot, not bothering to look back. I didn't have to. Whoever had sent that message already knew exactly where I was and what I'd taken. I didn't stop until I was halfway to Denver, headlights slicing the dark. I pulled into an all-night diner and tried to steady my breathing. My hands were still trembling. When I used a disposable phone to call a colleague, materials scientist I trusted just enough to risk it. I told him I needed an urgent analysis, that the sample was a legacy of a classified research contract. He hesitated, but agreed. I gave him a false name, a decoy, something to buy me time. By the time I reached the lab, dawn was breaking over the highway. I left the sample in an unmarked envelope and slipped back into the car. I told myself I'd done enough for one night, that I could disappear for a while, regroup. But less than 12 hours later, the lab was raided. The analysis file vanished. My colleagues stopped returning calls. I sat in my car, engine idling, and felt something inside me shift. The fear was still there, but it wasn't the same kind of fear that keeps you hiding behind locked doors. This was the fear that comes when you know you're committed, when you understand that whatever line you crossed, there's no going back. I closed my eyes and pictured my grandfather's last entry. They are watching. We were never alone, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that he'd been telling the truth. I spent the next 2 days driving without a destination, following back roads that wound between empty fields and shuttered gas stations. I told myself I was buying time, but the truth was simpler. I needed space to decide how far I was willing to go. The fragment weighed on me every mile. a silent reminder that my life, whatever it had been before, was over. Even if I abandoned the search, they wouldn't let me walk away. I'd seen too much. Late on the second night, I pulled over on the shoulder of a frontage road and called the last name in my grandfather's journal. Lillian Ortega, his closest confidant. The woman he'd trusted when he trusted. No one else. I wasn't sure what I expected her to say. Part of me thought she'd hang up. Instead, she listened in silence as I explained who I was, what I'd found, and what had already been taken. When I was done, she gave me an address in the foothills outside Golden. She didn't sound surprised. I reached her house just after dawn. It was a small adobe structure, half hidden by cottonwoods. She answered the door before I could knock. Her hair had turned white since the last photograph I'd seen, but her eyes were steady, unflinching. "You're Evelyn," she said, as if she'd been expecting me for years. She led me inside without another word. The living room was lined with shelves of old field journals and fossil samples. A wood stove ticked in the corner. She motioned for me to sit at a table covered in cloth-wrapped bundles. When she unwrapped the largest, I forgot how to speak. It was a fragment of the crystalline tablet my grandfather had. Described a curved slab of translucent material, its surface etched with patterns so intricate they seemed to move under my gaze. Lillian laid her hand flat on it. For a moment, I thought the surface pulsed in response. "He called it a record," she said quietly. It showed him everything: star maps, sequences of genetic data, a history that didn't belong to any civilization we know. I asked her why she'd kept it hidden all these years. She closed her eyes, as if remembering something she wished she could forget. "Because the last time we tried to share this, they came for us. Your grandfather was the first to disappear. I was lucky enough to run." She glanced at the door, her voice dropping. "They never stopped looking." I studied the fragment, trying to understand what kind of intelligence had left it buried under the Nevada desert. My grandfather's notes called them the curators, an intelligence older than humanity, committed to preserving something we were never meant to discover. When I placed my palm on the tablet, a low vibration rippled through my skin, settling deep in my chest. The symbols brightened in delicate lines of blue light. Images flooded my mind: celestial diagrams, figures standing beneath alien skies, 1,000 overlapping voices repeating the same phrase in a language I didn't recognize. I pulled my hand away, my pulse hammering. Lillian looked at me with something like pity. "It does that," she murmured. "It makes you part of it." I asked her if she'd ever managed to translate the records. She shook her head. "Not fully. But one part was clear. They called us a limited viability experiment. They'd been monitoring us for thousands of years, and every so often they intervene." I felt the weight of those words settle into my spine. The tablet wasn't just evidence. It was proof that our history was curated, rewritten, whenever it suited them. She reached across the table, her hand resting on mine. "If you want to end this, you need to find the main archive. That's where they stored the complete record." "Where?" I whispered. She didn't hesitate. "Colorado, a mountain facility the military still denies exists. Your grandfather believed it was the final vault. The place they took everything." I stood, feeling the edges of my old life dissolve for good. Whatever happened next, I couldn't unknow what I'd seen. Lillian wrapped the fragment in cloth and pressed it into my hands. "Be careful," she said. "Whatever you think you're doing, understand this: they will not hesitate to erase you." Outside, The wind stirred the cottonwoods. The sky was a pale, impossible blue. I walked back to the car and set the fragment on the passenger seat. For a moment, I let myself imagine the life I was leaving behind, the life of dusty archives, quiet lectures, the illusion of certainty. Then I started the engine, and I drove toward the mountains. I drove north through the foothills until the road narrowed into gravel. Every mile felt like a confession I couldn't take back. I knew by then that no one was coming to rescue me, not the authorities, not my colleagues, not anyone who still believed the story ended in a library or a courtroom. By the time I reached the outskirts of Estes Park, the sun had dropped behind the ridgeline. The fragment on the seat beside me glowed faintly in the twilight, as if it knew where I was headed. I pulled over to call Miles Rowe, the only person left I thought I could trust. He was an archaeometallurgist, an old friend who'd once staked his career on defending my grandfather's work. I told myself he wouldn't betray me. When he answered, his voice was calm, measured in the way it always was when he didn't want me to hear he was afraid. I explained what I'd found and where I was going. I asked if he could help me decode the crystalline fragment. He didn't hesitate. "Bring it here," he said. "I'll clear the lab." I knew something was wrong before I reached the parking lot. The building was dark, but a single overhead light glared over the loading dock. A black SUV idled near the service entrance, its engine too quiet to be anything off the shelf. Still, I walked inside. The corridors smelled of solvent and old concrete. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness. When I reached Miles' lab, the door was already ajar. He was standing by the workbench, his hands braced on the edge, eyes fixed on the floor. It took me a moment to realize he couldn't look at me. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't know who else to call." Then I heard the movement behind me, boots on polished concrete, the click of a safety disengaged. 3 men in plain clothes stepped into the doorway. The first held up a badge I didn't recognize. No agency name, just a crest that looked like a stylized eye. "You need to come with us," he said, his voice as smooth as polished glass. "We can't let you leave with that artifact." Miles looked up then, and in his eyes I saw exactly what I'd become: liability, a danger to anyone who tried to help me. I didn't answer. I turned and ran. I heard them shouting as I sprinted down the corridor. The fragment clutched against my chest. Alarms blared as I hit the service tunnel door and forced it open. The cold night air knifed across my face. I didn't stop, not when I reached the car, not when I saw the other SUVs pulling into the lot, not even when I realized Miles hadn't called them out of fear. He'd called them because he believed surrender was the only way to keep me alive. The tires screamed as I peeled out onto the highway. I drove blind, the lights behind me flickering like a dying constellation. When I finally pulled onto a remote turnoff, I sat there in the dark, my breath ragged. I opened the glove box and felt along the inner seam until I found the tracker. A smooth disc, no larger than a coin. I threw it as hard as I could into the scrub beside the road. Then I leaned back and closed my eyes. In the darkness, I pictured my grandfather in that last photograph is hollow, wrists bound, still fighting to keep this knowledge from disappearing. And I saw myself, caught in the same narrowing corridor. He'd walked, forced to choose between survival and truth. I understood then that the line was gone. Whatever boundary used to exist between curiosity and obsession, between scholarship and treason, had vanished the moment I touched that crystalline surface. I started the engine again, the fragment resting in my lap. The road ahead was empty, a dark ribbon unfurling into the mountains, and for the first time I felt certain of one thing. If I didn't finish what my grandfather started, no one would. I drove all night, past the empty turnouts and darkened cabins that clung to the mountainside, like sentinels. The air grew colder with every mile, thinning into something sharp enough to cut dot by dawn. I reached the trailhead. It was nothing more than a gravel lot bordered by rusted fence posts. No sign marked the path, no indication that anything waited. Beyond the pines, I shut off the engine and sat in the stillness, hands resting on the fragment in my lap. For a moment, I let myself remember what it felt like to be ordinary, to wake up believing that history was something we studied, not something that could erase you when you looked too closely. Then I opened the door and stepped into the cold. The climb took hours. I moved through stands of aspen and shattered granite slopes, following the coordinates Lillian had given me. When I finally reached the ridge, I found the vent just as she'd described it. A narrow slit cut into the rock, half hidden by a cairn of loose stones. I knelt and pulled the rocks aside until the shaft yawned open. The air that rose from it was impossibly cold, carrying the sterile temps of old machinery. My breath clouded in front of me. I climbed down slowly, one rung at a time, until my boots touched a metal floor. A motion sensor flickered to life overhead, bathing the corridor in sterile white light. The walls were smooth alloy, etched with the same symbols that ran across the fragment. My heart slowed, the way it does when you understand that you've stepped past the last threshold. I walked for what felt like miles. Doors lined the passage-sealed vaults labeled in a cipher I could almost read. Some part of me wanted to open them all, to catalogue every artifact, every record they'd stolen. But instinct kept me moving forward. At the end of the corridor, I found the chamber. It was larger than I imagined, an amphitheater carved into the mountain's core. Cabinets lined the walls, each containing objects that defied easy description: crystalline rods, plates of unknown alloys, spools of something that shimmered when I looked away. I set my pack down and began to photograph everything, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. It felt almost clinical methodical, as though documenting it could strip away the dread. Then I saw the pod. It stood on a raised platform in the center of the chamber, sealed behind a transparent barrier. Frost rimed the glass in delicate patterns. I wiped it away with the back of my sleeve, and I saw him, my grandfather, perfectly preserved. His hair floated around his face, as though he was suspended in water. His eyes were closed, and for a moment I almost believed he was sleeping. I pressed my hand to the glass. In that instant, every question I'd carried collapsed into a single realization: he hadn't died fighting to protect this secret. He'd been taken because he understood it too well. A console glowed beside the pod. I touched it, and a projection flickered to life, an archive of human history rendered in shifting constellations of light. The records described cycles of intervention, resets that had erased entire civilizations before ours. Each harvest collected not only artifacts, but people, witnesses, and anomalies too, dangerous to leave behind. One phrase repeated over and over in the text: limited viability experiment. I didn't have time to process what it meant. Alarms erupted, painting the chamber in red pulses. Motion sensors tracked my movements, marking me as an intruder. I ripped the storage device from the console and sprinted for the corridor. My boots struck the metal floor in a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat, like the echo of every step my grandfather had taken before me. I didn't look back. I only knew one thing. Whatever else the curators intended, I had something they hadn't accounted for. Proof, and this time, I wasn't going to let it disappear. I emerged into the pre-dawn dark, my breath ragged and white against the cold. The mountains stretched out below me, pale ridgelines fading into the horizon. For a moment, there was only silence. The alarms in the vault had cut off the instant I crossed the threshold, as if the mountain itself were exhaling. Then I heard it, a low hum, resonant enough that I felt it in the cavities of my chest before I understood it was real. I turned, scanning the slopes, and there it was, hovering above the tree line. A craft, neither plane nor helicopter, shaped like an almond of polished obsidian. Its surface shimmered in a way that made my eyes water. No lights, no markings, just a pulsing, impossible presence. I stood rooted to the snow as it descended, the hum swelling until it drowned out my heartbeat. A part of me wanted to run, but something deeper held me in place, a conviction that if I turned away now, everything I'd sacrificed would lose its meaning. A beam lanced out from the underside of the craft. It wasn't light, exactly, more like a column of vibration, so dense it seemed to bend the air. It struck the storage device clutched in my hand. I felt it, then a presence that was not mine. It pressed into my mind, not with words, but with impressions. Catalogues of extinct species, images of cities turned to ash and rebuilt again. A sense of endless, tireless assessment. They were measuring me the way I might examine a fossil. I raised the device against my chest, bracing for it to be torn away. But the beam pulsed and dimmed. The presence receded, leaving me shaking and unmoored. The craft lingered above me, silent and inscrutable. Then it began to rise, its form growing smaller against the paling sky. A final pulse of resonance rolled across the slope, on last acknowledgement that I was known. Marked, I watched until it vanished beyond the ridge. Only then did I realize. I was kneeling in the snow, my hands clenched around the device so tightly my knuckles had gone white. I forced myself to stand. My breath came in shallow bursts, each one crystallizing on the air. I understood what they'd decided. I wasn't a threat, not yet, just a variable to monitor. Some part of me felt relief at that. The rest of me knew better. I retrieved a snow vehicle I'd stashed behind an abandoned ranger station weeks before. As I loaded the device into a padded crate, my hands stopped trembling. I felt something close to clarity. This was no longer about vindicating my grandfather. It wasn't even about proving the visitors existed. It was about what came next, what humanity would do with the truth, now that I'd wrested a piece of it from the dark. I started the engine. The treads bit into the crusted snow, carrying me down the slope toward the narrow forest road as the first light of morning broke across the trees. I looked back one last time at the place where the vault lay hidden beneath the rock, and I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that the watchers had not gone. They were simply waiting to see what I would do. I drove until the trees thinned and the snow gave way. 2 ragged patches of dry grass. The old ranger road wound down into a shallow valley where the world felt empty, as if even the air had been stripped of witnesses. I pulled the snow vehicle behind a stand of bare aspens and killed the engine. For a while, I just sat there, my hands resting on the crate that held the storage device. I knew I couldn't keep it hidden forever. That was never the point. The point was to decide what kind of ending I could live with. I'd spent my life trying to reconcile faith in evidence with respect for the unknowable. Now there was no boundary left between the two. What I carried was proof that humanity had been curated, tested, and in some erased. Proof that the story of our origins was a controlled narrative, edited whenever it suited the watchers. I turned on the satellite phone I'd hidden in the lining of my pack. It connected after a moment's delay. The display pulsed with a single prompt. Transmit. I hesitated. Once I sent the data to the journalist network, there would be no retraction. No quiet negotiation. This was the threshold my grandfather never crossed. The line between survival and truth. But before I could press the key, headlights swept across the far ridge. A convoy of dark vehicles descended the slope in disciplined formation. Dust trailed behind them, luminous in the early light. I knew who they were. Project Hearth wasn't a name anymore. It was a machine, vast and relentless, designed to outlive any of us. A single SUV split from the others and rolled to a stop 50 yards from my position. The passenger door opened and a man climbed out, tall, deliberate in the way he moved. He didn't carry a weapon, but that didn't comfort me. He approached slowly, his boots crunching frost-hardened grass. When he spoke, his voice was almost gentle. "Dr. Hart, you don't have to do this." I didn't answer. My thumb hovered over the transmit button. He studied me in silence. Then he gestured toward the convoy. "You can walk away, right now. This doesn't have to end like it did for your grandfather. You're going to bury it," I said. My voice sounded thin in the cold air. He inclined his head, as if acknowledging a simple fact. Because the alternative is collapse. Everything. We take for granted our institutions, our confidence in our own history gone overnight. I thought about that, about the fear in Walter Keane's voice, the hollow acceptance in Colonel Parsons' eyes. What happens to me if I give you the device? I asked. "You disappear," he said evenly. "A new life, if you want it, or no life at all." The way he said it chilled me more than the morning air. My hand tightened around the phone. "And if I send this?" He looked past me toward the east, where the sun was breaking over the ridge. "Then you will be remembered as the person who dismantled the last illusions we had about ourselves." For a moment, I felt almost weightless. I thought about my grandfather's final words in the journal. "We have a right to know where we come from." And in that instant, I knew what he'd understood, that the truth was never something you protect. Out of fear, it was something you gave away because it didn't belong to you alone. I pressed the button. The phone vibrated once. Then again. Transmission begun. The man's expression didn't change. He only lowered his gaze, as if offering me a moment of private grief. Behind him, the operatives began moving forward. I knew it was over, but as the broadcast indicator reached 100%, I felt something unburden inside me. I set the phone down in the frost, and I closed my eyes as the boots approached. I didn't open my eyes when they reached me. Hands gripped my arms, firm but almost respectful, as though even now they recognized that something had changed. They bound my wrists behind my back and walked me past the crate, past the satellite, phone still glowing with the transmission complete prompt. I kept my gaze on the horizon. The first warmth of morning was spreading across the valley, thin rays catching in the dust kicked up by the convoy. For a moment, it looked beautiful like any ordinary dawn. They put me in the back of an unmarked vehicle. The doors locked with a soft, mechanical sigh. I watched through the tinted glass as the other operatives gathered the crate and loaded it into the lead SUV. Even then, they moved with the quiet efficiency of men who believed it wasn't too late to make this disappear. But I knew better. Somewhere, beyond these mountains, the archive files were moving through networks no one could fully control. Servers, mirrored drives, encrypted feeds. I had sent them everywhere. To journalists, to researchers, to every contact willing to risk their careers to verify what I had found. I felt no triumph in it, only a steady, hollow certainty. When the engine started, the man who had spoken to me climbed into the passenger seat. He didn't look back. For the first hour, no one said a word. We descended narrow switchbacks and passed a scattering of farmhouses. The road felt impossibly long, as though the mountain itself didn't want to let go of me. Eventually, he turned around. His eyes were the same careful grey as the stone I'd climbed over to reach the vault. "You understand," he said quietly. "You will never see freedom again." I nodded. He studied me as if searching for regret when he didn't find it. He looked away. Outside the window, the landscape opened into a plain. I could already imagine how the story would spread, how the first headlines would be dismissed as hoaxes, then reluctantly confirmed, how the footage of the chamber would loop across every screen on the planet. Proof of alien curation, of the harvests, of the unbroken chain that stretched back to a time before our species had a name for itself. I thought of my grandfather, of his last moments in that vault, knowing he could never share what he had learned. I thought of Lillian, waiting for news she would not live long enough to see. I thought of everyone who would wake up today, believing their world was unchanged. And I understood the cost, but I also understood the promise. When we reached the facility, they led me down a corridor lined with fluorescent lights. The walls were painted the same lifeless shade of grey I'd seen in every secure installation. A place designed to erase identity as efficiently as it contained it. They put me in a small room with no windows. The door shut behind me with a final, resonant click. For a long time, I sat on the edge of the cot, hands resting in my lap. I tried to remember what it had felt like to be a researcher, a skeptic, someone who believed the line between myth and evidence was clear. I couldn't. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness behind my lids, I saw the tablet's projection starfields and genetic diagrams, luminous threads binding every human life to something older and immeasurable. I thought about the Watchers, about how they must be observing now, patient as ever, waiting to see what humanity would do with the truth. I felt no fear, only a quiet acceptance that my part was over, outside, beyond the walls. The world was waking up to the knowledge it had been curated all along. I kept my promise. We were no longer alone in the dark. Sometimes, the question that unravels your life doesn't come in the form of an accusation. It comes quietly, as if it's been waiting for you all along. That question was, have you considered the origin of these markers? And from the moment I heard it, I knew nothing would ever feel certain again. I should have ignored the man who asked. He blended into the back of the auditorium so well, I nearly forgot his presence. My colleagues shuffled their notes, whispered about funding, proposals and clinical trials. But that question lodged itself under my ribs like a splinter. I've learned to trust that kind of discomfort. I've learned it usually means something is about to break. My name is Dr. Adrian Voss. For most of my adult life, I believed I was. chasing a rare gift buried in the human genome, an immunity that could outwit the deadliest viruses of the modern age. My work at the North Atlantic Virology Institute was supposed to be a purely scientific pursuit. It never occurred to me that what I was mapping might be more than the product of evolution, or that I was walking straight into the aftermath of something no one had ever wanted explained. After the lecture, I returned to my lab in the East Wing, still replaying that question. I pulled up the participant files again, flipping through clinical histories and genealogies that, for years, had felt like ordinary data. As the rain tapped against the windows, I read the notes with new eyes. The details were subtle, a sentence buried in a case file, a remark in the margins of an intake form, a father vanishing on a fishing trip without a trace, a grandmother who disappeared during an afternoon walk, her footprints ending at the edge of a fallow field. No struggle, no sign of foul play, just absence, the kind that leaves nothing behind but the suggestion of something you don't have language for. But it was Leela's file that finally made me understand this was more than a genetic puzzle. She was 8, bright, curious, the kind of child who asked questions until you couldn't help but love her for it. I'd seen her only days earlier, giggling as I showed her how the sequencer worked. When the call came that she was gone, I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. A runaway, maybe. An abduction, though that word felt too crude for the way her mother described it. She said there had been a light outside the bedroom window, so bright it made her think of surgical lamps. She'd woken to find the window open, the curtains fluttering in the dawn breeze, and her daughter's bed empty. I'd seen panic before. Viruses do that to families. But this was different. This was a kind of hollowed-out terror I couldn't quantify or dismiss. When I opened Leela's file again, I found the note her mother had included with the consent forms. It was written in a looping hand, the ink smudged in places as though she'd cried while she wrote it. She dreams the same thing, the note read, a voice telling her she was never ours, that she came from somewhere cold and far away. I read that sentence over and over until I realized my hands were shaking. It was so absurd, so out of place in a medical record, but it felt truer than anything else I'd read that day. I stayed in the lab until the lights in the hallway went out and the cleaning staff began their rounds. My colleagues believed I was the most rational man among them, the least inclined to superstition, the least likely to see ghosts in data. But as I closed Leela's file, I felt a conviction forming in me, one I couldn't dismiss. If these families shared the same immunity and the same stories of disappearances and lights, then the origin of their genetic markers was no accident. Something had put it there, generation after generation, like a thread woven through the human story, waiting for someone foolish enough to follow it. I remember sitting in that lab, the rain slowing to a drizzle against the glass, and realizing I would be that fool. I would trace it back as far as it would go, and I would find out what it meant to carry something in your blood that didn't belong to this world. That was the night I'd stopped being a scientist, searching for answers, and became a man with something to lose. And in the quiet that settled over the lab, I understood the cost of that choice. Whatever I found next, I wouldn't be able to walk away. In the days after Leela vanished, I began reanalyzing the sequences we'd collected. I told myself it was the only way to keep from feeling helpless. Every night, when the building had emptied and the corridors went quiet, I sat alone at my terminal, studying the gene markers. I thought I understood. It was past midnight when I saw an irregular pattern in the nucleotides that didn't belong in any known human genome. I blinked hard, convinced it had to be a computational error. But the anomaly persisted, row after row of codons, repeating in a symmetry I couldn't explain. I cross-referenced every database at my disposal, public, restricted, and one I wasn't supposed to access without clearance. Nothing matched. The closest I came was an obscure theoretical paper proposing that panspermia, the seeding of life across planets, might leave behind molecular signatures. I sat there, the monitor casting pale light over stacks of files, and felt a cold certainty settle in my chest. This wasn't just a rare mutation or a forgotten branch of evolution. It was something introduced, something designed. I felt like a trespasser reading a message that was never meant for me. That same night, I retrieved an old diary ID flagged months earlier. It belonged to Thomas Abernathy, a farmer from upstate New York whose descendants were in my study. The diary dated back to 1872. Most of the entries were ordinary accounts of harvests and debts. But one passage was different. He described a night when the stars descended, and his family woke to find the livestock dead and the children feverish. He wrote about dreams that lasted for days, visions of a vast darkness filled with shapes he couldn't name. In the weeks that followed, he recorded that none of his children ever succumbed to the waves of cholera that swept through the neighboring counties. I set the diary beside the genetic readout, feeling the gap of centuries collapse in an instant. Abernathy's children had carried the same sequence I'd found in Lila. I knew that because their living descendants were sitting in my database, their blood quietly preserving whatever had happened that night. When I cross-referenced a date of the diary entry with astronomical records, I discovered something that made me feel as if I'd been holding my breath for years without knowing it. On October 14th, 1872, there had been a meteor shower over the region, a phenomenon so intense that newspapers described it as a storm of falling stars. No samples had ever been recovered. No analysis conducted beyond the superficial. The convergence felt too precise to be chance. For the first time, I wrote in my own notes a sentence that felt dangerous simply to acknowledge. The anomaly is not random. I underlined it twice, as if that could make the words any less real. I began to wonder whether the missing children across generations weren't missing at all. Perhaps they were retrieved, just as Leela had been. The idea felt ludicrous, the kind of paranoid conjecture I'd spent my career dismissing in others. But the evidence refused to be ignored. Each record I examined revealed the same pattern: sudden disappearances, descriptions of unnatural light, and afterward, the quiet inheritance of the same immunity that had drawn me to this work in the first place. I kept thinking about Leela's mother and the note she'd left behind. You were never theirs. I tried to imagine what it felt like to write those words, to suspect your own child had been claimed by something you couldn't see or fight. By the end of that week, I'd stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the genetic sequence repeating in darkness, a pattern older than any country, any institution, older even than our species might have been prepared to accept. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found, not yet. Part of me still hoped there would be another explanation, something mundane, something I could report in a peer-reviewed journal without sounding unhinged. But deep down, I knew I had already crossed a threshold. The story I'd been telling myself about my research, about my life, was unraveling, thread by thread, and there was no going back. When dawn finally came, I sat in my office watching the sun climb over the parking lot, trying to convince myself I was still the man I had been a week earlier. But I wasn't. I was already someone else, someone who understood that the question of where we come from was no longer theoretical. It was personal, and it was waiting for me to follow it further. It didn't take long for my research to attract the attention I'd spent my career avoiding. In those first days, after I documented the anomaly, I told myself I was being cautious, just double-checking the locks, varying my drive to the lab, monitoring the building's access logs. But a part of me already knew I was preparing for something I couldn't yet name. On a grey morning that felt no different from any other, 2 men appeared in my office doorway. They wore dark suits and carried identification. They flashed too quickly for me to read. Their expressions were neutral, in the practiced way I'd seen in federal agents testifying before oversight committees. An almost blank civility that made the hair on my arms stand on end. One of them asked to see my research protocols. The other stood by the door, his gaze steady and impersonal. I handed over a sanitized version of my reports, careful to exclude any reference to the diary, the meteor shower, or the coded sequences. The taller man flipped through the file as if he already knew what it contained. When he looked up, his voice was low, almost conversational. "You need to discontinue this line of inquiry," he said, effective immediately. I kept my face neutral, though my heart was beating so hard it felt like it might bruise my ribs. "May I ask why?" He studied me for a moment, then set the folder on the edge of my desk. "For national security reasons, that was all. No further explanation. No threats. Just the suggestion that if I knew what was good for me, I would walk away before I became part of something I couldn't control." They left as quietly as they had arrived, leaving the door ajar behind them. I sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself this was an overreach by an overzealous agency, an error that would be corrected once they realized my work was purely scientific. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Someone had known exactly what I was searching for, and they were willing to intervene to keep it hidden. That evening, I called Dr. Eliana Brooks. She had been a rising star in exobiology before her career imploded under the weight of accusations that she was manufacturing evidence of alien intervention in human history. Most of my colleagues dismissed her as an opportunist, but I had read her work and found it disquietingly plausible. When she answered, her voice was wary but not surprised. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. "You found it, didn't you? The markers." I told her everything: Lila's disappearance, the diary, the genetic sequences, the visit from the men I could only assume were part of an agency with more reach than oversight. As I spoke, I realized how unmoored I sounded. But Eliana didn't interrupt or laugh. When I finished, there was a silence that felt heavier than any response. "They're called Harvest," she said finally. "A coalition of intelligence and private contractors. Their mandate is simple: suppress anything that proves we were never alone." I closed my eyes, trying to process it. "You're saying this is a coordinated operation?" "It has been for decades," she said. "Longer, probably. They track every study that comes close to identifying the anomaly. If you keep going, they will do more than visit your office." Outside my window, the last light of the day was slipping behind the trees, and for a moment I felt as if I were watching the world end in slow motion. The idea that this conspiracy had quietly orchestrated disappearances, possibly for generations, felt too large to hold in my mind, but the evidence was already there in my files. In the blank spaces, in old records, in the terror I'd seen in Lila's mother's eyes. I asked her why. Why suppress something that could save millions from disease? Why hide the truth if it had been with us all along? Because it isn't just about immunity, she said. It's about origin. And whoever controls that story controls everything. After we ended the call, I sat alone in my office, the darkness pooling around me. I should have been afraid. Part of me was. But beneath the fear was something stronger, an inexorable pull toward the truth. Even if it cost me my safety. Even if it cost me my life. I understood then that this was no longer about curiosity or scientific ambition. It was about survival, about deciding whether the story of our species would stay buried in sealed files and locked rooms, or whether just one person would finally drag it into the light. And as the night deepened, I knew I'd already made my choice. I spent the next few weeks in a kind of quiet exile. I stopped going home most nights. My office became the only place that felt even marginally safe, though I knew that was an illusion I was clinging to out of habit more than conviction. My lab assistant, a young woman named Carla, started leaving early without asking questions. She didn't have to. We both understood that whatever I was doing had crossed a threshold she wanted no part of. I began collecting everything: archival documents, declassified military records, old property deeds. I was looking for a pattern, but I didn't know what shape it would take until I saw it forming in front of me. It was subtle, like a watermark that only emerged under the right light, a trail of disappearances, each linked by the same few details: bright lights, sudden illness, then nothing at all. Families left behind with no explanation, but the quiet certainty that something had taken their loved ones. Most of the records were so old they felt more like folklore than evidence. One, dated 1623, describes settlers in New England who had vanished overnight, leaving behind only a half-finished cabin and livestock wandering the clearing. Another file contained a deposition from a sheriff in rural Wyoming, who, in 1948, swore, under oath, that he had seen a craft hovering silently over a farmhouse. In his statement, he said the house had been lit from the inside by a pale blue glare, and when he entered, every room was empty. I kept thinking of the Abernathy diary, the fever dreams, the meteor shower that left no physical trace. But each new document added weight to the suspicion that these events weren't isolated accidents. They were part of a deliberate harvest that had been happening long before any of us had the vocabulary to describe it. It was almost dawn when Carla slipped me a flash drive without meeting my eyes. "You didn't get this from me," she whispered. "They're clearing out your data. I don't know how long you have." By the time I turned back to ask her what she meant, she was already gone. I spent that morning going through the drive, and for the first time, I felt the true scale of what I'd uncovered. Surveillance logs, internal memos, even classified, reports I shouldn't have been able to access. Every document pointed to the same conclusion: my work had crossed a line. The coalition, Ileana, called Harvest, had been monitoring me from the moment I'd sequenced the anomaly. They weren't simply keeping tabs, they were preparing to erase everything. I knew then that staying put wasn't an option. So I left the Institute under the cover of darkness, driving north without a plan beyond survival. The highways felt emptier than I remembered. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror seemed to linger a little too long before disappearing behind me. I drove until sunrise and stopped in a town I'd never heard of. Checking into a roadside motel with a false name and cash I'd pulled from a safety deposit box I hadn't touched in years. The room was small, stale with old cigarette smoke, but for the first time in weeks, I let myself believe I might have bought a little time. I spread the records across the bed-weathered pages and digitized files, crude sketches of crafts hovering above fields. One journal entry caught my attention more than the rest. It was dated 1841 and had been preserved by a historical society in Maine. The handwriting was cramped, but legible. They have come to claim what is theirs. We are not sick. We are changing. I traced the letters with my fingertip, imagining the fear that must have accompanied those words. And in that moment, I stopped pretending this was about science anymore. This was about inheritance, about something so old it had rooted itself in our blood. The disappearances, the immunity, the dreams, they were all evidence of a lineage none of us had consented to, but had inherited all the same by the time dusk fell over that anonymous stretch of highway. I knew I would have to keep running. Harvest would not stop. I had seen too much, learned too much. But each new clue was also a promise that the truth was close. So close, I could almost feel it breathing against my neck. I looked out the window at the darkening sky, thinking of Lila and her mother's note. You were never theirs, and for the first time, I wondered if that warning had been meant for me too. I knew they were watching. Harvest was never careless enough to let anyone slip their notice for long. But in those early days, they still believed they could contain me. That if they gave me enough room to run, I'd eventually lead them to every copy, every contact, every hidden backup I had prepared. It wasn't trust that bought me time. It was calculation, the quiet confidence of an operation that preferred observation over confrontation. They were waiting to see how far I would go before they closed the net for good. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat in the dim light of the motel lamp, sorting through every file Carla had saved before it was scrubbed from the Institute's servers. I read until the words blurred together and the shapes on the page stopped feeling like language. But just before dawn, buried in a folder of misfiled Cold War intelligence reports, I found the first real answer. It was a declassified military study, originally marked Eyes Only and dated 1962. The document described an operation I'd never heard of, a joint initiative between the Department of Defense and a clandestine division within the Public Health Service. The language was sanitized, clinical, but the intention was clear. They'd discovered the genetic anomaly in a blood sample taken during a routine vaccination trial. Instead of reporting it, they had launched a project to isolate and replicate it. They called it Operation Prometheus, an effort to harness the markers for biological warfare. The report detailed months of experiments on volunteers, most of whom had never been told the real purpose of the trials. It described their symptoms in precise, chilling language: fever, confusion, vivid hallucinations. A small percentage disappeared altogether. The official conclusion was that the anomaly was extraterrestrial in probable origin, introduced to the human genome between the 15th and 17th centuries via unknown vector. I read that sentence so many times it stopped feeling real. I had to remind myself to breathe. They had known, decades before I was born, that the DNA I was studying wasn't an accident. It wasn't evolution. It was an intervention, one that had shaped entire family lines in secret. When I reached the final page, I felt something in me break open. The last paragraph was a recommendation to discontinue the project, citing unacceptable risk of contamination and unauthorized transmission. But at the bottom, in a different hand, someone had scrawled a single line in pencil: retrieval protocols remain in effect until further notice. I sat back in the chair, pressing my palms against my eyes. I knew then that the disappearances weren't random at all. They were organized extractions retrievals conducted under the cover of darkness and buried in decades of bureaucratic obfuscation. And I realized something even harder to accept. My family was among those listed in the appendices. My great-grandparents, flagged as high-probability carriers of what the report called pure strain sequences. My grandfather, who had vanished without a trace in 1953, was listed as a retrieval. His name marked by a single word, recovered, in the quiet that followed. I felt the last illusions I'd been clinging to fall away. This wasn't just research anymore. This was my inheritance, my blood. I thought about Lila again, how her mother had described her dreams, the voice whispering, "You were never theirs." The words felt different now, less like a warning and more like a declaration, a reminder that the line between belonging and being claimed was thinner than any of us understood. I tried to imagine what it meant to be part of a species that had been altered without its knowledge, cultivated across centuries, for a purpose no one alive had chosen. I thought of the diary entries, the meteor showers, the families left standing in empty fields, searching the sky for answers they would never receive, as the morning sun began to brighten the parking lot outside my window. I knew there would be no going back to my old life. The only question left was how far I was willing to go to expose the truth, and whether I could do it before harvest closed in for good. I packed my files and the external drive into a battered canvas bag and slipped out of the motel before the clerk was even awake. As I walked across the lot, I looked up at the pale blue of the early sky. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what I was carrying. Not just evidence, not just a theory, but the story of who we were and who we might have been if no one had ever come to claim us. By the time I reached the research station, Ileana had prepared. I'd been driving for nearly 2 days. My body felt hollowed out from the hours on the road and the steady, low-grade terror that never seemed to fade. Every time I stopped for gas or food, I scanned the parking lot for the same black SUVs, the same blank faces pretending not to watch me. The station was tucked into the foothills, miles from the nearest town. From the outside, it looked like a weather monitoring outpost, just a squat concrete building surrounded by antennas and satellite dishes. But when Eliana opened the door, I saw the reinforced doors, the biometric locks, the rows of redundant power supplies. She had been preparing for this longer than I had realized. "You look worse than I expected," she said, her voice soft in a way that made me feel dangerously close to collapsing. I'd been worse. I lied. She took my bag and gestured. Me inside. We didn't speak much as she led me past the ground floor lab and down to the lower level. It was there, in a room lit only by the pale glow of a dozen monitors, that I finally allowed myself to feel the cost of everything I'd uncovered. She motioned for me to sit. I've been pulling together every record I could find, classified. Studies, first-hand accounts, sightings that were buried before they reached the media. When I described my plan to release the data if anything happened to me, she didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied the wall behind me, her mouth pressed into a tight line. Only after a long silence did she nod. At the time, I took it as agreement. Now, I wonder if she was already making her own calculations. You were right, the disappearances. Track with retrieval operations. I swallowed, my mouth too dry to form a proper response. But there's something you need to see, she said, turning one of the monitors so I could read the screen. It was a real-time feed deep space surveillance. Data from a military array in Alaska. They're coming, she said, her eyes locked on mine. Not in theory, not someday. Retrieval ships, multiple vectors. They're in our atmosphere. I felt the room tilt around me. All those years I'd believed the bright lights were just metaphor stroma, transmuted into folklore. But it was real. It had always been real. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on my breathing, but it was no use. The realization was too large to contain. The timetable wasn't abstract anymore. Whatever purpose had driven centuries of harvesting was accelerating, and every person with the pure genetic markers was in immediate danger. That night, I sorted through the files Eliana had assembled. It was the most complete record I'd ever seen. Diagrams of craft design, transcripts of intercepted communications, names and locations of families flagged as carriers. As I read, it struck me that this was what Harvest was trying to prevent. The moment when someone like me would hold enough evidence to force the world to look up. But the more I studied the files, the more I understood the depth of the threat. Harvest wasn't the only danger anymore. Even if I escaped them, the retrievals would keep coming, unstoppable and indifferent. Around midnight, I found a list labeled Primary Retrieval Targets Priority Sequence. My eyes scanned the names, one by one, feeling a coldness that settled in my chest like a stone. Near the top was Lila's family. 2 lines below, in the same unremarkable font, was my own name. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. All this time, I had believed I was chasing something outside myself, a phenomenon, an origin story, an intrusion into human history. But it had never been abstract. It had always been personal. As dawn crept in through the narrow windows, Eliana found me still sitting at the table. She didn't ask if I'd slept. She only studied my face and seemed to understand the decision forming behind my eyes. "You can disappear," she said quietly. "Change your name again, or you can try to warn them." I knew what she meant. I could run and let the retrievals continue in secret, or I could expose everything, no matter the cost. I looked out at the pale sky, thinking of the centuries of quiet abductions, the families that had never learned why their children never came home. My own grandfather, whose story had been erased with a single word, recovered. I turned back to the files, my hand resting on the drive that held the names of every living carrier. In that moment, I understood that running wouldn't save any of us, and whatever time remained, it was already running out by the time I left the research station. Dawn was already draining the last traces of darkness from the sky. I drove east along back roads, keeping the windows down to fight the exhaustion that pressed at my skull. Every so often, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and shaven, hollow-eyed, and wondered if I still looked like the man who had started this work. I ended up in a town my family had passed through generations ago. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions if you paid in cash and didn't linger too long at the diner. I rented a room in a small boarding house and carried my files upstairs one by one. The floor creaked under my boots. The air smelled of old plaster and the faint sweetness of mildew. It felt fitting, somehow, to be here. This was where the trail of records pointed a line of disappearances and fragmented recollections that led straight back to my own bloodline. I had come looking for context. Maybe I was hoping I'd find some way to make sense of what had happened. To my grandfather, to all of us. I spent hours going through the brittle pages of family ledgers and letters. The ink faded to brown. Each account felt more intimate than the last. My great-grandmother's journals were the hardest to read. The final volume was written in a sloping hand, words collapsing into themselves as if she'd been too tired to form them fully. In the last entry, she described a dream that kept returning. She wrote of a cold place filled with columns of blue light and figures suspended in mid-air, dozens of them, their bodies held aloft as if gravity had been undone. She said she felt no fear, only an overwhelming certainty that she was among her. "Own, I saw them," she wrote, "and I knew we were the same." I sat with that sentence a long time, the paper warm under my hand. I thought about the stories my mother used to tell, half-remembered rumors about a legacy that didn't begin in any village or country, a legacy that had never been fully human. I opened the folder marked primary retrieval targets again. The names blurred in my vision, but one fact was inescapable. Fewer children were born with the pure markers every generation. The genetic line was dissolving, the original sequence thinning into something too diluted to retrieve. It struck me that the retrievals were not just an effort to reclaim what had been ceded. They were a last attempt to preserve something on the verge of extinction. I wondered if that was why the retrieval ships were coming now, faster than ever before. If their urgency was nothing more than the desperation of a species facing its final erasure. I didn't know whether that made them more terrifying or more human. By the time the sun slid behind the hills, I'd filled half a notebook with dates and theories, none of it feeling like enough. In the quiet of that room, I realized that if the aliens were archivists, custodians of their own disappearing legacy, then what I had been calling abductions was something closer to reclamation. They were taking back what time and interbreeding had almost obliterated. But that revelation came with another truth I could no longer pretend to ignore. My own genetic profile was among the purest remaining. It was why they would come for me, just as they had come for Lila, just as they had come for my grandfather. I sat at the edge of the bed, the window open to the night breeze, and tried to imagine what it would feel like to stand in that column of light. Whether, at the final moment, I would feel the same recognition my great-grandmother described, a quiet surrender to something older and vaster than anything I had ever believed in. And yet, even as that inevitability pressed in, I felt a steady resolve hardening in my chest. I was not ready to disappear, not while I still had the means to warn others, to leave behind proof of what we were and what had been done to us. Outside, the wind rattled the loose pane in the window frame. Somewhere far overhead, I imagined the retrieval ships moving across. The darkness quiet, patient, certain of what they would claim. But for now, I was still here. And as long as I was, I still had a chance to decide what this story would become. I left the boarding house before sunrise, carrying only the essentials: my files, the external drive, a burner phone I'd been careful never to power on near the same place twice. I'd learned to travel lightly, to let go of anything that might slow me down if I needed to disappear. But no precaution felt adequate anymore. Eliana and I agreed to meet in an abandoned train depot 2 hours north, a place she said was secure, though I was starting to understand that no place stayed safe for long. The drive felt longer than it should have, each mile measured by the same looping question. How many people had known the truth and still chosen silence? When I arrived, she was already waiting, standing near the rusted platform with her arms folded tight against the morning chill. For a moment, I let myself believe she was still the same woman I'd trusted with everything that illusion held. Until she looked up at me, her expression more resigned than apologetic. "You have to understand," she began, her voice brittle. "I didn't have a choice. I stopped where I was, one hand resting on the strap of my bag. "How long?" I asked, though I already knew. "Since before you called me," she said quietly. "They came to me years ago, told me if I cooperated, I could keep my work, my freedom." Her eyes moved to the cracked concrete at her feet. "I thought I could protect you, but you went too far." A kind of numbness spread through me. I'd prepared myself for pursuit, for the inevitability that harvests would close in eventually. But betrayal, this particular betrayal, felt different. It was the final confirmation that I'd never been more than a step ahead of the net tightening around me. "You fed them everything," I said. "Every location, every document." "No," she said quickly, her voice sharpening. "Not everything. I never told them about the archive." I frowned, trying to understand. "There's a site," she continued. "An observatory decommissioned in the 70s. I found references to it in the same files you've been studying. The aliens left something there record, a vault. If you get to it, you'll have evidence strong enough to expose all of this." I searched her face for any sign she was lying. But what I saw was worsen, exhaustion so complete it bordered on surrender. "They'll be here soon," she said. "You should go." I tried to speak, but the words tangled in my throat. It wasn't just the fear of what was coming. It was the grief of realizing that even the people closest to me had been forced to choose survival over loyalty. I turned to leave, but she caught my arm. Her hand was shaking. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "But you have to understand, if you release the truth, everything will collapse. People won't accept it. They'll turn on each other." I pulled my arm free. Maybe they deserve the chance to decide for themselves. Her eyes filled, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her coat and held out a folded sheet of paper. "The coordinates," she said. "That's all I can give you." I took it without meeting her gaze. For a moment, we stood in silence. Two people who had once shared a purpose and now had nothing left to say. I walked back to the car, the paper clutched in my hand, and forced myself not to look back. As I started the engine, I felt the last thread tying me to any illusion of safety snapped cleanly in in the rearview mirror. Ileana remained by the platform, her silhouette blurred by the rising wind. I tried to remember her the way she had been before all of this, a scientist, searching for meaning in a universe that offered none. But the memory wouldn't hold. As the depot receded behind me, I unfolded the paper and read the coordinates. The observatory was hundreds of miles away, buried in wilderness. No road reached directly. It didn't matter. I would find it, whatever the archive held. It was the last chance to drag this story into the open before the retrieval ships descended for good. And as I drove into the thinning morning, I felt a clarity I hadn't known since the beginning. No one was coming to save me, but I could still save the truth. The drive to the observatory felt like a descent into some final threshold. I watched the landscape change, mile by mile, empty roads, giving way to pine forests so dense they swallowed every trace of the sky. I stopped only once for fuel, paying cash and avoiding eye contact with the clerk, who kept glancing at the news playing behind the counter. I knew what he was seeing: a series of unexplained lights moving in formation over the western seaboard. Official denials, amateur footage that looked too much like what I'd found in the archives. By the time I reached the forest access road, dusk was bleeding into the trees. I left the car hidden in a stand of evergreens and set out on foot, my bag heavier than it had ever felt. Every step felt deliberate, like the ground itself was measuring my resolve. The observatory was little more than a concrete dome half swallowed by the hillside. Its windows shattered, the roof collapsed in places. Moss had crept over the threshold, softening the lines of what had once been a monument to human curiosity. I paused at the entrance, the last light catching on rusted metal and broken glass, and tried to steady my breathing. Inside, the air was colder than I expected. My footsteps echoed through the cavernous chamber as I picked my way past collapsed scaffolding and overturned desks. For a moment, I wondered if this place had ever been abandoned at all, or if someone had made sure no one came back. I found the hatch beneath a scorched panel in the floor, just where Eliana's coordinates said it would be. The cover was welded shut in places, but the metal had been weakened by time. I pried it open with a length of pipe and felt a rush of air colder than the night itself. The shaft beneath descended into darkness so complete it felt like a physical pressure. I lowered myself onto the ladder, careful not to think about what might be waiting at the bottom. The rungs ended in a wide chamber ringed with old generator housings and blank monitors, their surfaces coated in a fine layer of frost. I took a slow step forward. The air smelled metallic, as if some ancient machinery had only just powered down. In the center of the room stood a single structure, a tall, arching framework covered in plates of an alloy I couldn't identify. The surface seemed to shift in the beam of my flashlight, as if it were absorbing rather than reflecting the light. I set down my bag and approached it, each footstep muffled by the frost that gathered under my boots. When I touched the nearest plate, the surface rippled under my hand. A low vibration moved up my arm, into my ribs, settling behind my eyes. I knew, without any doubt, that this was the archive, the final repository of everything the retrievals had been trying to preserve. The proof harvest had spent generations suppressing. A panel slid open with a hiss I felt more than heard. Inside was a recess holding a translucent sphere the size of my skull. Patterns moved inside it, too ordered to be random, too fluid to be a simple projection. My breath misted as I lifted it free. The weight surprised me, far heavier than it looked, as if the object contained not just information, but gravity itself. I set it on the floor and activated the small reader I'd brought. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the sphere emitted a pale light that grew until it filled the chamber. Symbols and sequences projected across the walls, genetic diagrams interlaced with star charts, records of abductions stretching back before recorded history. I saw the same sequences I'd found in Lila's blood, the same codes that marked my grandfather's disappearance. But here, in this vault, they were presented not as anomalies, but as a lineage evidence of a plan that had outlived empires, outlasted every effort to bury it. I felt something loosen in my chest. For the first time, I understood the full shape of it. Earth hadn't been chosen at random. It had been seeded, cultivated, watched. And the retrievals were not an invasion, they were a final attempt to keep a fragment of another world alive inside us. My throat tightened as I worked to extract the data, copying every file to the drive I carried. The process felt endless, each transfer bar creeping forward with agonizing slowness. When it finally completed, I tucked the drive into an inner pocket and let my hand rest over it. As I climbed back up the ladder toward the ruined dome, I heard the low whine of engines approaching overhead. The retrieval ships had found me, just as they always would. But this time, I wasn't leaving. Empty, dash-handed dot. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to peace. No matter what waited outside that hatch, I had the truth. And before this was over, I would make sure the world saw it too. I emerged into the night just as the first retrieval ship cut across the clouds, its hull catching the moonlight in a way that made it look almost beautiful. I stood at the edge of the observatory platform, the cold wind lifting the collar of my coat, and for a moment I let myself look up without fear. The ship hovered in absolute silence, its underside opening in a smooth iris of light. I felt a strange pull deep in my chest, a resonance that made my breath catch. It wasn't just gravity or the knowledge that I was about to be taken. It was the final acknowledgement that this was always where the path would end. My hand went to the pocket where the drive rested. Even as the beam of pale blue light descended, I didn't move. Instead, I tapped out the last commands on the encrypted transmitter I'd hidden in the lining of my bag. Each keystroke sent a duplicate of the archive's data to servers I'd set up months earlier, university labs. Independent researchers, journalists who'd never known my name. The files were still uploading when the light touched me. For a moment, nothing happened. The observatory lay silent under the stars. The only sound, the rasp of my own breathing. I let my eyes drift across the broken consoles and collapsed scaffolding, trying to fix every detail in my mind. This was the place it had all led to, every sleepless night, every hidden record, every life stolen and never returned. I thought about the families who would finally know why their children had never come home, and the quiet, stubborn hope that maybe that knowledge would be enough. Then the air changed. A pressure I felt more than heard pressed against my skin, and the night seemed to fold in on itself. The light found me, pale and impossibly bright, and for the first time, I didn't try to run. I felt the warmth first, then the suspension of weight as my boots lifted from the cracked concrete. For a heartbeat, the fear returned sharp, reflexive, but it softened almost immediately, replaced by a clarity I hadn't known I was still capable of. I looked down as the observatory fell away beneath me, the broken dome shrinking to a dark smudge against the trees. I thought about the generations who had disappeared like this, leaving only silence behind. The families who never learned the truth. The children who had grown up believing their parents had simply walked away. But this time, the story wouldn't end in darkness. The files were already spreading beyond anyone's control. By the time Harvest realized what I had done, it would be too late to bury the evidence again. As the retrieval ship drew me into its hold, the air around me shimmered with an almost organic hum. My heart pounded in my throat, but I forced myself to keep breathing, to stay present. If this was the moment I was meant to reclaim my inheritance, whatever that meant, I would meet it without flinching. Inside, the light dimmed to a soft glow. For a moment, I felt the strangest sense of familiarity, as if I had been here before in some other life, or as if this place had always been waiting for me to remember it. My body settled onto a platform that felt impossibly smooth beneath me. I looked around, searching for some confirmation that I hadn't imagined everything, that this wasn't just the last hallucination of a man who'd run too far for too long. And then I saw them. Translucent forms held in suspension around the perimeter of the chamber. They were neither fully human nor fully alien, but something between. I understood without needing any voice to explain. They were the others who had been retrieved. The chamber was nothing like I'd imagined. It wasn't sterile or cold. The walls pulsed with a soft, organic glow, as if the entire space was breathing. I moved slowly, drawn toward the rows of translucent forms suspended in the pale light. They looked almost peaceful, their features blurred by something I couldn't name. In that moment, I understood that this was never about conquest or cruelty. It was about preservation, a final attempt to salvage a fragment of a world that had long since slipped into extinction. I felt something loosen in my chest, a quiet acceptance I wasn't ready to call peace. The ones who had come before me, kept in preservation like artifacts of a dying civilization. I felt no fear anymore, only a quiet sorrow that it had taken me this long to see how small we were in the face of something so old, so determined to endure. I closed my eyes as the soft pressure moved through my skin, reading my genetic code, confirming the inheritance I could never escape. But even as it did, I held on to the last thought I knew was mine. I had kept my promise. Outside, the coalition would be scrambling to contain the leaks. Politicians would issue statements. Experts would debate the authenticity of the files. But it wouldn't matter. The truth was out. The story was bigger than any of them now. When I opened my eyes again, the ship was rising through the clouds, carrying me away from the only world I'd ever known. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was leaving home. I felt like I was returning to it. In the end, it was simple. We had never been alone. And whatever else could be said of the species that seeded us, that shaped us across centuries, they had given us something no conspiracy could ever erase. The knowledge that we carried the remnants of another world inside us. I closed my eyes, one last time as the ship ascended into the darkness, and let the knowing settle in my bones. That was enough. They all described the same place, colossal gallery of glass cylinders holding frozen, watchful bodies, and they had never met each other. That was the detail I couldn't explain, no matter how many times I reviewed the transcripts. My name is Dr. Eleanor Voss. I've spent over 20 years helping people reconstruct the broken landscapes of their minds. Trauma leaves footprints, predictable patterns that can be traced and understood. But nothing in my training prepared me for the case of the gallery dream. It started with one patient, a quiet, middle-aged man named David, who came to me reporting a recurring nightmare. In it, he stood barefoot on a polished floor that stretched endlessly in every direction, the air so cold it made his teeth ache. He was surrounded by towering cylinders filled with human figures, suspended as if in some kind of display. When he pressed his palm to the glass, he said, he felt a presence pressing back from the other side. I'd heard of shared delusions, contagious ideas, and the suggestion that trauma can find parallel expression across strangers. That was my first rational explanation. But then, a week later, a woman named Gina sat across from me and described the same nightmare in almost perfect detail. She had never heard of David, never seen his notes, but her voice cracked the same way his had. When she tried to describe the symbols glyphs, she called them that glowed along each cylinder's base. The symbols never stayed still. They shifted, rearranged themselves, but left the same impression in her mind. Preservation. By the time the third patient, a teenager named Matthew, told me about the gallery, I'd stopped trying to pretend this was a coincidence. I spent late nights in my office, poring over their transcripts and voice recordings. The glow of my desk lamp turned the antique spines of my psychiatric texts into a forest of shadows. My office was a cluttered Victorian study tucked into a narrow brick building near Chicago's lakefront. The brass clock on the mantel clicked in the silence, marking time that never seemed to matter while I was working. On one wall hung a framed photograph I'd inherited from my grandmother, an old black and white image of a woman in a high-collared dress standing in front of a rural asylum. I'd always found her expression unsettling. Her eyes seemed fixed on something just out of frame, something she didn't want to name. In the months ahead, I would come to understand that look. I tried to be methodical. I cross-referenced every detail, searched academic journals, combed through case studies of mass hysteria, false memory implantation, archetypal dream symbolism. Nothing fit. The architecture they described: corridors arching at impossible angles, the cold that seemed to seep into the bones, the sensation that the bodies were alive, had no precedent in any psychological literature. And the symbols, I couldn't even begin to categorize them. Each time I closed my eyes, I found myself picturing the gallery, trying to assemble it like a puzzle from their fragmented accounts. At first I told myself this was only professional curiosity, but a part of me, some deep, uneasy instinct, felt that these dreams weren't dreams at all. They were memories of something real, something none of us were prepared to confront. It was nearly 3 in the morning the night I laid out every transcript side by side across my floor. I traced the common details with a pencil, connecting them in thin, precise lines that spiderwebbed over the pages. When I finally looked up, I realized how cold the room had become. The radiator was on, but I could see my breath in the lamplight. That was when the thought first came to me, as clear and undeniable as the ticking of the clock. If they were chosen to remember this place, maybe I was chosen to witness it. In that moment, I understood something had already begun, something that would strip away every certainty I had about memory, identity, and our place in the world. I spent the next week avoiding the obvious conclusion. It was easier to keep telling myself I was assembling an elaborate psychological case study than to admit the truth that kept circling in my mind like a vulture. But denial has limits. Mine ended the night I decided to dig through the old storage trunks in my basement, looking for any family records that might explain why the photograph on my wall had always made me uneasy. The trunks smelled of mildew and forgotten summers. My grandmother's handwriting labeled each box in her crisp, looping script: household accounts, letters, property deeds. At the very bottom, I found a ledger bound in cracked brown leather. The date on the spine was 1906. When I opened it, I recognized the asylum in the photograph. The ledger was a record of patients committed there, notes on their diagnoses, treatments, final dispositions. I didn't expect to see my own name, or something close enough to it to make my breath catch. Margaret Voss. I read the entry 3 times, my eyes skimming over the archaic language. Patient reports nightly visions of a hall of glass canisters, containing preserved forms of unknown origin. She had described the same dream. Every detail, the impossible geometry, the cold that felt alive, the luminous script she called angelic ciphers. But the notation that stopped me cold was simpler than the rest. In the margin, in a faded pencil scrawl, someone had written, "She believes she was taken, displayed like a specimen. She says they are watching her still." My hands were shaking when I set the ledger down. For a long moment, I sat there in the cold basement air, feeling the weight of something much older than coincidence pressing against my shoulders. I tried to tell myself it was just a family myth, some buried trauma passed through generations. But the clarity of her description, the precise alignment with my patient's accounts, was too specific to dismiss. Later that night, I returned to my office with the ledger. I spread my own case notes beside it, matching the descriptions line by line. My rational mind searched for another explanation: contagion of ideas, genetic predisposition to vivid dreams, But there were no shared environments, no mutual acquaintances. The only link was blood. And that was when I made the mistake of searching the archives of the Chicago Herald, the old editions digitized in a database few people ever used. I spent hours reading stories about people who disappeared and returned changed. One article from 1921 described a farmer who vanished for 3 years, then walked back into town unable to remember his own name. Another piece detailed a woman who claimed to have been preserved in a chamber beneath the earth, only to awaken with a circular scar near her temple. By dawn, I had found dozens of cases. Different decades, different cities, always the same refrain. Lost time, unplaceable scars, and memories of a place that sounded exactly like the gallery. I knew then that this wasn't just my patient's affliction. My great-grandmother had been part of it, and I was too. I tried to sleep, but the thought wouldn't let me. Instead, I sat in my armchair as the sun climbed over the city. I watched the light slide across the spines of my books and wondered how much of my life I had misunderstood. That evening, I closed my office early. I left a note for my assistant, telling her I needed a few days away. But as I gathered my notes, a chill crept over my skin. A part of me already knew what was coming, though I didn't want to face it. That night, for the first time, I dreamed of the gallery myself. It felt nothing like a dream. I remember standing barefoot on the icy floor, the cylinders towering over, me in perfect rows. The symbols glowed in the darkness, shifting in quiet synchrony. I reached out, and my fingers met the glass. My reflection stared back with wide, unblinking eyes. When I woke, there was a thin, tender line at my hairline, a scar I had never seen before. That was when I stopped pretending I could keep this separate from my life. I wasn't just cataloguing a phenomenon. I was becoming part of it. And whatever it was, whatever force had chosen my patients, my family. And now MIT wasn't finished yet. The morning after the dream, I tried to behave as if nothing had changed. I brewed coffee, opened the office, and greeted my first patient with the practiced warmth I'd perfected over decades. But beneath my professional composure, every breath felt borrowed. I kept catching myself touching the tender scar at my hairline, as if confirming it was still there. By the afternoon, I gave up pretending. I cancelled my appointments and locked the front door. I sat at my desk, surrounded by the ledger, my transcripts, and the yellowed newspaper clippings. And I tried to decide whether to tell someone, IDN, single quotes, T. instead. I started cross-referencing names from the old asylum records with modern medical databases. I don't know what I thought I'd find proof, maybe that this was all inherited delusion. But the pattern was unmistakable. Generations of people describing the gallery, the cold, the cylinders, always with the same sense of being watched. Around dusk, I heard the soft mechanical click of my office door unlocking. For a moment, I thought, it was my imagination. Then the handle turned. A man stepped inside, wearing an ill-fitting charcoal suit. He carried a small black case in one hand, the kind government inspectors used. He had a thin, lined face and pale eyes that never quite settled on any object in the room. Dr. Voss. His voice was measured, almost sympathetic. I'm with the Department of Health and Human Services. May I have a moment of your time? Didn't answer. I only studied him, noting the tension at the corners of his mouth, the way his eyes flicked briefly to my ledger. He glanced around the room, as if expecting someone else to join us. We've been notified that you've been conducting independent inquiries about certain sleep disturbances among your clients. I felt a surge of anger, then fear. Who notified you? He ignored the question. This line of inquiry is not recommended. It's potentially destabilizing to individuals and communities. His tone was polite, but the threat was unmistakable. I asked to see his identification. He lifted the case in a practiced motion, flipping it open just long enough for me to glimpse a seal I didn't recognize, a abstract pattern of interlocking triangles. No name, no agency title. I'm only here to advise you, he said evenly. Continuing this research may complicate your professional standing. You could find your licensure under review. I waited for him to leave, but he didn't. He stood there in the doorway, studying me as if weighing something more than my compliance. At last, he set a small white envelope on the edge of my desk and turned to go. When the door clicked shut, I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single page. Discontinue all investigation into anomalous dream phenomena. This is your only notification. There was no letterhead, no signature. After he left, I sat in the gathering dark, watching the city lights flicker on beyond my window. I tried to tell myself it was a bureaucratic intervention, a precaution against panic. But deep down, I knew it was more. His demeanor wasn't that of a regulator. He had come to ensure silence. That night, I searched for the symbol on his badge. After hours trawling through declassified archives, I found a reference buried in a Cold War intelligence memo, Project Loci. No details, only that it had been established in the 1950s to study mass disappearances and memory phenomena of uncertain origin. By dawn, my fear had become something sharper resolve. If Project Loci was watching me, it meant my work had stumbled into something real, something they'd hidden for decades. The following day, my phone began to ring at odd intervals. Caller ID, no messages. My patient files disappeared from my locked cabinet. A box of records I'd left in my car was gone by morning. It was clear I wasn't merely documenting an anomaly anymore. I was in its path. I wish I could say I considered stopping then, that I weighed the risk and turned back. But when I closed my eyes, I saw the cylinders, the shifting symbols, the face in the glass that looked so much like mine. I understood the stakes were no longer academic. I was being prepared for something, chosen or claimed I didn't know. And I sensed that whatever had marked my family across generations wasn't finished with me. I left Chicago at dawn the next day. My hands trembled as I packed my car with the boxes of files I'd managed to salvage. I drove north until the city's sprawl gave way to quiet highways and stands of birch and pine. By afternoon, I reached the cabin, a narrow timberside place I hadn't visited in years, perched on the edge of a small lake in rural Wisconsin. It was the only place I could think to go where I might still have a measure of privacy. I spent the first night pacing the single room, listening for engines. In the dark, every rustle in the trees felt like an approach. But when dawn came without interruption, I forced myself to believe I'd bought some time. I laid everything I'd collected across the floor: the 1906 ledger, my patient transcripts, the newspaper archives, and the partial files I'd pulled. From declassified intelligence reports, each piece felt like part of a story I couldn't yet read in full. I started with my great-grandmother's diaries. They were brittle with age, their pages thin as onion skin. She wrote in a small, precise hand, often crammed into the margins. She'd described her dreams in excruciating detail, the same gallery, the same cold. But there were other phrases I hadn't encountered before, preservation, cultural cataloguing, the selection. That word repeated more times than any other. Selection. As the days passed, I noticed how quickly my professional detachment was unraveling. Each time I traced a pattern, each time I found another reference to the gallery, I felt the line between curiosity and dread blur a little further. On the fourth day, I received a call I didn't expect. It came from an archivist I'd reached out 2 months earlier, asking about symbols resembling the glyphs my patients described. He'd never replied, but now, in a voice low enough to force me to strain to hear, he told me he'd found something. He said the symbols weren't strictly alien. They bore a striking resemblance to early Sumerian ideograms, some signifying memory, others heritage, and one that defied simple translation. A word that could mean extinction or preservation. I thanked him and hung up. I remember staring out the window at the frozen lake and realizing this wasn't just a private phenomenon or a family curse. It was something that had been moving through history for longer than any institution or nation. I tried to sleep that night, but the dream returned. This time, the gallery felt closer. The walls seemed to pulse with a living presence, the glyphs shifting more rapidly. In the dream, I was no longer merely an observer. I felt as if I were being studied in return. When I woke, my skin was cold to the touch. I examined the scar near my hairline in the mirror. It had darkened, a fine line of almost metallic sheen catching the light. I spent the day trying to distract myself by cataloging the old asylum records. I noticed an unsettling pattern. Every patient who described the gallery had vanished within a year of first recounting the dream. Some were declared dead, some were never found at all. Late in the evening, a call came from the Chicago clinic. My assistant's voice cracked as she told me one of my patients, David, had disappeared from his apartment. No signs of forced entry. No note. I felt something inside me shift then. The dread I'd carried like a second skin settled into resolve. This was no longer an investigation. It was a countdown. I spread my notes across the cabin table and wrote out everything I knew, everything I suspected. I started to draft letters to trusted colleagues, though I knew most of them would never believe me. In the quiet between midnight and dawn, I tried to imagine what the gallery was for. A prison, a museum, a seed vault for culture itself. And I found a thought taking root that I couldn't dismiss. Perhaps it was all those things at once. The more I traced the patterns, the more inevitable it felt that I would see the gallery again, not in dreams, but in whatever reality it belonged to. I told myself I had come here to buy time, to gather evidence, to decide what to do next. But in my heart, I knew I was only preparing for the moment when the selection came for me in the end. It wasn't a dream or an anonymous warning that pushed me toward the final evidence. It was an impulse, some quiet instinct that I wouldn't have time later. By then, the fear had become familiar, something that settled around my shoulders like a coat I couldn't remove. At dawn, I left the cabin and drove back to Chicago, winding through empty highways. Under a sky that felt too wide, too indifferent, I parked 4 blocks from the asylum, what remained of it. The main building had been converted into a storage annex decades earlier. Most of the records were boxed and forgotten in the basement. I used the same archivist credentials I'd relied on before. No one stopped me. In hindsight, that was almost more unsettling, as if whatever force had guided me here wanted me to see what was waiting. The basement was cavernous, the concrete walls etched with water stains. I walked past the rows of shelving until I found the section marked 1906, 1914. My breath missed in the cold as I opened the first box. Ledger after ledger. Lists of the committed, their conditions, the treatments administered. Most entries were mundane melancholia, nervous exhaustion, the diagnoses of a different century. But in the fourth box, near the bottom, I found a ledger bound in faded green cloth. It was heavier than the others. I opened it carefully, scanning the familiar columns of names and dates. And there she was, Margaret Voss. But this time there were more entries. Detailed notations from her final days in the asylum. She had become increasingly insistent that she was being prepared for removal, that she had been shown visions of the cylinders, each marked with the same shifting script. She wrote about voices she heard in the walls, a low harmonic song that lulled her to sleep. The last entry was dated 2 days before her disappearance. In a narrow margin, her handshake T, but legible had written, "They will come for you when you remember." I read the line over and over, tracing the letters with my fingertips. It felt less like a warning than a confirmation, a recognition that the dreams weren't just glimpses of something hidden, but triggers, signals that unlocked memories sealed by design. I closed the ledger and sat back against the shelving. The silence of the basement seemed to deepen, pressing in around me. I thought of David and the others, of the pattern that stretched back generations, each person marked by the same dreams, the same scars. A realization settled in my mind then, clear as anything I'd ever known. I was never merely studying the phenomenon. I was part of its mechanism, an instrument of recollection. I examined the scar at my hairline under the harsh fluorescent light. It no longer looked like an injury. It looked like a seal, a mark confirming that whatever intelligence had harvested these memories would soon reclaim the vessel that held them. I copied every relevant entry into my notes, then photographed each page. Part of me felt absurd, like a child hoping that proof could somehow protect me. But I knew this was bigger than any evidence I could gather. Before I left, I noticed a thin envelope tucked between 2 ledgers. No markings, no address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, brittle with age. Project Loci, internal memo, -1958. I skimmed it, my pulse quickening. The memo described a protocol for managing reports of the gallery dream. Individuals were to be monitored discreetly. If signs of advanced recollection emerged, specifically the appearance of the glyphs in waking visions, they were to be retrieved. The word chilled me more than any other. Retrieved. That night, back in the cabin, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark, listening to the wind scrape across the roof. I imagined the cylinders, their cold glass pressing against my skin. I tried to picture my great-grandmother standing there before me, her eyes fixed on something just beyond sight, and, for the first time, I allowed myself to ask what the archive was for. Not just a record of culture, but a living repository, a vault of consciousness itself. I think, in some buried corner of my mind, I already understood the truth. The gallery wasn't a dream, it was a destination, and I was already on my way there. After I left the asylum basement, there was no possibility of returning to my life as it had been. The ordinary rituals, morning coffee, clinical notes, the comforting repetition of appointments felt hollow, like habits borrowed from someone else. My thoughts circled back to that single word in the memo, retrieved. I spent days tracing the other names listed in the ledger, Some were too old to follow records, lost or destroyed, but a handful led to living people, survivors who had vanished and returned. If I could speak to them, maybe I could understand what was waiting for me on the other side of the dream. The first was Jacob Emery. He was listed in a 1972 newspaper clipping as a missing person. 4 years later, he reappeared without explanation. His family moved shortly after. It took weeks of quiet calls and favors from old colleagues to find him living alone in a rented cabin in northern Michigan. When I finally stood on his porch, I felt a tremor of recognition, the same restless unease that had haunted me since my own first dream seemed to live in the air around his home. He answered the door slowly, studying me with a caution that told me he already knew why I'd come. "I've been waiting for someone like you," he said in a voice that was quiet but steady. "Come inside." His living room was sparse, no photographs, no decorations, just a low table stacked with spiral notebooks, each filled with neat, deliberate handwriting. He gestured for me to sit, then eased himself into the chair across from me. "I don't have much time before they realize you've found me," he said. "So ask what you need." I asked him what he remembered about the time he was gone. He closed his eyes. For a moment, his expression softened, as if he were reaching into a memory he'd tried to bury. "I remember the cold," he began, "the taste of metal in the air, and the cylinders, thousands of them, arranged in a perfect grid. I was inside. One, I couldn't move, but I was awake. It was like they were showing me something." He opened one of the notebooks and turned it toward me. The page was filled with the same glyphs I had seen in my own dreams. They replayed fragments of my life, he said, his voice trembling. Memories I'd forgotten, faces, moments. But it wasn't just mine. I saw visions, artifacts of other civilizations, languages I couldn't understand. They were collecting it all, curating it. "Why?" I asked. "To preserve it," he said simply, "before whatever comes next." He pulled up his sleeve to reveal a mark near his shoulder, small puckered scar shaped like an open eye. It was identical to the scar hidden in my hairline. "You've been marked," he said, like I was. Before I could respond, headlights swept across the cabin window. Jacob's face turned pale. "They've found me," he whispered. He glanced toward the old radio set on the counter, its red indicator light blinking softly. "I shouldn't have answered your call," he said. "They monitor everything." He moved quickly, pressing a folded sheet of paper into my hand. "Take this. It's everything I've remembered. Maybe it will help you finish what I couldn't." Outside, a pair of unmarked vehicles rolled to a stop in the gravel drive. Men in dark clothing stepped out, moving with a deliberate precision I'd come to recognize. Jacob looked at me one last time, his eyes hollow with resignation. "Don't follow me," he said. "Don't try to find me again." Then he slipped out the back door into the darkness. I waited, my heart hammering in my chest as the men forced their way inside. They moved past me without a glance, following Jacob's trail into the woods. I didn't stay to see what happened next. I drove through the night, the folded paper clutched tight in my hand. By dawn, I was back at the cabin in Wisconsin. I spread Jacob's notes across the table, feeling the same cold certainty I'd felt in the asylum basement. The glyphs he'd copied were nearly identical to the symbols in my dreams. But there were other notations, coordinates, references. 2 rituals of preservation dating back centuries. Hints that entire families were chosen across generations. I realized then that my time was running out. The men who had taken Jacob wouldn't stop. And whatever was embedded in my memory, whatever that scar signified, was already drawing me closer to the gallery. For the first time, I understood that escape wasn't possible. The best I could do was to finish documenting everything before I vanished too. I didn't return to Chicago after that night. Instead, I stayed in the cabin, windows covered, phone switched off, every light extinguished after dusk. I knew it wouldn't keep them away forever, but it bought me time to read Jacob's notes, time to cross-reference them with the asylum ledger and the declassified Project Loci files. Some of the symbols he'd recorded matched the Sumerian glyphs my archivist contact had described. Others were older, patterns I couldn't place. But no matter how many hours I spent tracing their shapes, I couldn't escape the same realization. The glyphs were a language, not just a record, but a command, a set of instructions that rewrote whoever encountered them. On the fourth evening, as dusk settled over the frozen lake, I heard footsteps crunching across the snow. I reached for the pistol I kept hidden in the drawer, an old revolver I'd never thought I would need, but when the knock came, it was soft, almost tentative. I peered through the gap in the curtains and felt my heart lurch. Dr. Armand, he had been my colleague for over a decade, my closest confidant, the only person I trusted with the earliest details of my research. In all the weeks since I'd fled the city, I hadn't heard a word from him. A part of me had wondered if he'd already been silenced. I opened the door cautiously. He stood there in his wool coat, breath misting in the cold, his face drawn with something like shame. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I had to find you before they did." I stepped aside to let him in. He moved to the small kitchen table without waiting to be asked, as if he'd been here many times before. He set down a battered leather satchel and pulled out a thick folder. "Don't have much time," he said, meeting my eyes. "They know I came, but you deserve to see this." I unfolded the cover. Inside were documents marked with the same triangular seal I'd seen on the agents. Identification, transcripts, surveillance photos, internal memos. My name appeared over and over, flagged in red. "You were assigned to me," I whispered. All this time, he didn't deny it. His hands were trembling as he turned the pages. "They call it Project Loci, but that's just the surface. There's a deeper protocol. Families like yours are considered prime cultural vectors, bloodlines, targeted because of what you carry. Memory, heritage, genetic markers. No one outside the project even knows how far it goes." I felt a numbness spreading through me, as if all the fear and exhaustion had finally crystallized into something heavier than grief. "How long?" I asked. "Since before you finished your doctorate," he said. "I was told to watch you, to record everything you uncovered. But Eleanor," his voice cracked, "I didn't know it was this. I thought it was just a containment operation, a precaution, and in exchange for your loyalty," I said, my voice hollow, "they gave you access." He didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. I turned the pages slowly, taking in the evidence of every betrayal. One document detailed how retrievals were coordinated. Another described the scar near my hairline as an implant identifier. My breath caught when I read the last memo. "Subject has entered advanced recollection phase. Retrieval recommended within 72 hours. My hands shook as I lowered the folder. The cabin felt too small, the air too thin. He reached across the table and gripped my wrist. "Listen to me," he said, his eyes fierce with something I hadn't seen in him before, remorse, maybe, or desperation. "They think you're still here. If you go tonight, I can delay them. A day, maybe two. Why help me now? Because I've seen what happens when retrieval teams arrive, he whispered. It doesn't end with questions. I looked at him, this man I had trusted more than anyone, and I tried to feel anger, but all I felt was sorrow. I can't run forever, I said quietly, and even if I could, it wouldn't matter. They'd still come. He didn't argue, he only pressed something into my hand, a small drive. It's everything I've collected. Evidence, names, locations. If you can get this to someone outside, maybe it will make a difference. I closed my fingers around it. For a moment, we sat there in the silence, two people on opposite sides of a chasm neither of us had chosen. When he finally stood to leave, he paused in the doorway. His breath fogged the glass as he looked back at me. I'm sorry, he said. Then he stepped into the darkness, and I knew I would never see him again. After Armand left, I didn't allow myself to sit still. Every instinct told me that whatever protection he could offer was already slipping away. I packed the evidence drive into the lining of my coat, layered the asylum ledger and Jacob's notes on top, and forced myself to walk out the door without looking back. I drove south under cover of darkness, staying on county roads that wound through the flat winter fields. My only plan was to reach Chicago and find a way to push the information into the public record. If I could leak the files to enough journalists, enough academics, it might be impossible for Project Loci to bury it again. But as the sky paled, with dawn, I felt the first flicker of something I couldn't rationalize, kind of static in my thoughts. Each time I tried to rehearse what I would say to the press, my mind blurred at the edges. My memories felt spliced together as if someone had cut the film of my life and rearranged the frames. By the time I reached the city limits, my temples throbbed with a dull ache. I pulled over near an old freight yard and killed the engine. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked hollow, the skin under my eyes already turning grey. When I closed my eyes, the gallery was there, waiting. But it wasn't just a vision. Anymore, I could feel the cold on my skin, hear the low hum of whatever intelligence had built that place. Each time I blinked, the waking world flickered, and the cylinders appeared in perfect, silent rows. I forced myself to keep moving. I drove to a contact I trusted, a freelance editor who had once helped me authenticate a patient's claims. His office was a cluttered suite above a pawn shop, the kind of place where no one asked questions. When he opened the door and saw my face, his expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. "You look like hell," he said. "I don't have time." To explain, I told him, "I need you to get this out. Every outlet you can find." I handed him the drive. For a moment, his eyes flicked to the window, as if he could sense the weight of what I was asking him to hold. "Are you in danger?" I almost laughed. The question felt absurd. I wasn't sure danger even covered it anymore. "Just promise me you'll send it," I said. He nodded. "I'll start right now." I thanked him, but before I turned to leave, the first seizure hit. My vision went white, a cold flash that seared down my spine. I collapsed against the wall, my hand splayed on the grimy plaster. When I came back to myself, he was crouched beside me, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" "I think," I whispered, "it's starting." I left before he could ask anything else. Outside, the street seemed to warp at the edges, as though the gallery were pressing closer, overlaying itself on the city. I stumbled toward the underground entrance to the old freight tunnels, an abandoned network I'd found in public works maps, a place I could hide until the files went live. I descended into the darkness, my breath echoing in the tunnels. Each step felt heavier than the last. My perception was fracturing, the waking world and the gallery bleeding together. When I turned a corner, I almost expected to see the cylinders waiting, bathed in their cold, shifting light. Above ground, I knew the operatives were coming. The men who had taken Jacob, who had erased my great-grandmother from the record. But some stubborn part of me still believed that if I could stay hidden long enough, the story would reach the surface. I found an alcove and sank to the concrete, clutching my coat around me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that made me feel more alive than I'd ever been. Somewhere between waking and dreaming, I heard the gallery's low song, the language of preservation threading through my thoughts, and I understood this wasn't just about recording humanity's memory. It was about transforming it, turning people into living archives. And my time as an observer was almost over. In the dark, I closed my eyes and waited for whatever would find me first. The collectors or the truth. I don't remember how long I sat there in the dark. Time was already unraveling, each moment stretching, unfolding back on itself. The low harmonic hum of the gallery threaded through my mind, a melody I could neither silence nor fully understand. My breath fogged in the cold air, and every so often I caught myself murmuring fragments of the glyphs, as if the language was working its way up from somewhere older than my conscious mind. When I finally moved again, it was because I felt the last flicker of fear give way to a steadier purpose. My body was weak, but the urgency in me had hardened into something that felt almost like relief. I climbed the rusted stairs up to a disused access hatch and emerged into the abandoned rail depot where the tunnels terminated. It was vast and empty, the high windows smeared with grime, the roof struts bowing under decades of neglect. Sunlight slanted through the gaps, falling in dull stripes across the cracked concrete floor. I knew this was where it had to end. I set up my old laptop on a shipping pallet and connected the drive Armand had given me. From my pack, I unfolded the compact satellite uplink dish I'd borrowed from a former colleague, an emergency measure I'd hoped I'd never need. I clipped it to the rusted railing and watched the indicator lights blink to life, steady green against the gloom. The connection was slow, painfully slow, but it would be enough. The files loaded in uneven. Pulses, photographs of the cylinders, surveillance reports, transcripts of dream accounts, references to retrieval protocols stretching back more than a century. As the upload began, I called my sister. My hands shook as I pressed the phone to my ear. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the last time I'd tried to warn her about the patterns in our family. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer, but then her voice came through, soft and wary. "Eleanor," I closed my eyes. My throat felt too tight to speak. "I don't expect you to believe me," I said finally, "but I need you to hear this." I told her everything, about the ledger and the dreams, the cylinders and the glyphs, the scar at my hairline that had never fully healed. I explained that our bloodline had been marked for generations, not by chance, but by design. That the archive was not just a place, but a processor curation of memory itself. She didn't interrupt. I imagined her standing in her kitchen, one hand braced on the counter, listening as her sister confessed something too large to hold. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Will I dream about it too?" she asked quietly. I felt tears slip down my cheeks. "I don't know," I whispered, "but if you do, don't look away." The upload completed with a dull chime. I set the laptop to transmit the files to every outlet I could think of: news, agencies, academic servers, public archives. If nothing else, the evidence would outlive me. I was still holding the phone when the first pulse of light seeped into the depot. At first, I thought it was just dawn, a trick of the broken windows. But the glow brightened, a clean, clinical white, that made every shadow seem impossibly black. My heartbeat slowed. The hum in my mind swelled into a single pure note that resonated in my chest. Some primitive part of me understood that the collectors had arrived. I stood very still. Part of me wanted to run, to find a corner of the world where their reach might not extend. But the other part, the part that had always suspected this was inevitable, felt a quiet relief. I raised the phone to my lips one last time. "Whatever happens," I said, my voice barely audible over the rising harmonic, "remember that we were more than specimens. We were witnesses." The light filled everything. My vision washed out into a white so bright it felt like a cleansing. My last sensation was the warmth of it on my face, as if the gallery itself had come to gather me. And in that final moment, I understood that I was not ending. I was becoming part of the archive. When my eyes opened, I wasn't in the depot anymore. I was standing or suspended in the gallery at last. The cylinders rose around me in perfect, silent ranks. From the inside, they were even more immense, their cold walls curving upward into darkness I couldn't measure. My breath misted in the thin air, but I felt no panic, only a peculiar, lucid stillness. My hands hovered just above my sides, unable to move more than a fraction. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, the same weary face, the same scar near my hairline, now faintly luminescent. Across the rows, I could see others preserved in their own transparent vaults, some with eyes closed in dreamless sleep, some wide awake and watching. There were faces I recognized from photographs in the asylum ledger. Jacob Emery, the woman I'd only known as Margaret Voss, her features soft and unlined. In the quiet, I understood that time had no bearing here. Memory was all that mattered. As I listened, I realized the hum I'd carried in my head for months wasn't just in my thoughts. It was the voice of the archive itself, vast, layered resonance that moved through every wall and every body. The glyphs on the base of my cylinder shifted in slow succession, patterns of meaning that I felt more than read. Preservation, transmission, continuity. I thought I might be afraid, but when I searched for fear, I found something closer to acceptance. All my life, I'd tried to catalogue and contain the evidence of what haunted me. Now I saw that this was never about erasing us. It was about recording, curating the thoughts and histories we carried. I don't know if the others felt it too, this realization that we were not captives, but exhibits. We had become living testimonies to the cultures we came from. A record of our species, held in a gallery so vast it would outlast any civilization. Through the glass, I watched as soft light shifted overhead, illuminating the faces of the preserved artists, philosophers, healers. Some looked serene. Others bore the same expression I felt etched across my own face. An uneasy wonder. At that moment, I understood the cost. The archive would protect our knowledge, but it would strip us of the one thing that made us human, our freedom to choose what we remembered and what we let fade. Back on Earth, I imagined the files I'd sent propagating across servers and news outlets. Some would be dismissed as fabrication, others would inspire fear, even worship. The conspiracy would endure because people would need stories to make sense of the evidence. But the truth was simpler and harder to bear. We were not alone. We never had been. I felt the last threads of my old life slipping away, my office, my patience, the woman I'd once been. I let them go. If this was the final role I would play it with my eyes open. And so I stood there, consciousness unspooling, into the soft glow of the archive. My thoughts flattened into something wide and calm. Every memory laid bare, a testament to the small, stubborn life I'd made. As the light dimmed, I felt my awareness settling into the quiet certainty that nothing had been lost. We had been gathered, not erased. We had become the evidence. And in that last flicker of thought, I felt something like peace. Thanks for listening to these chilling accounts of why aliens might be taking people and artifacts. If you enjoyed this, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves a good mystery. Let me know in the comments which story creeped you out the most. Stay curious and maybe keep one eye on the sky tonight.